Hello, everyone, and welcome to Policy Driven, a podcast on global transport policy. My name is Thomas Jérémy Hayden-Lefebvre, and I'm joined today by my co-host Mark Watt and two very special guests. This is our first episode of 2026, and we begin the year by turning to aviation and climate law at a moment when EU regulation is moving forward and global and domestic pressures on green policies and international actions continue to rise. Today, as I mentioned, we're joined by two very special guests working at the intersection of aviation and law. First off, we have Mr. Steven Truxal, Professor of Air and Space Law and the Director of the International Institute of Air and Space Law at Leiden University. Second to him, we have Mr. Garry Pratama, a PhD researcher focusing on the intersection between ICAO's CORSIA scheme and the regional and regulatory approaches to aviation emissions. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
And Happy New Year.
And Happy New Year to you, Mark.
And Happy New Year to you all. Looking forward to it.
Stephen, let's start with you. Many people working in transport policy or in the broader transport policy circle come to aviation or transportation by way of business studies, economics, and engineering. How did you find your way into aviation law? It's quite a niche, isn't it?
Well, there are lots of people who are practicing aviation law, but there are not so many places teaching it. So it's actually something that many people learn on the job. But my story really starts with, I've always been fascinated with flying and aviation generally. But I studied economics first and then got a job with Lufthansa, pursuing a management training program where I was trained up to do different things in the passenger and cargo business and sent different places in the world to do that. Later then studied law. So when I was learning law through the eyes of the airline industry, because that was really the only industry I knew anything about. So add those things together, economics plus some short experience working for a major global airline and law. And perhaps if you're lucky, one day you end up to be the law professor doing air and space law in Europe.
Absolutely. How about yourself, Garry? I imagine you joined the sector a bit later than Stephen or Mark. How did you come to study and later research aviation law?
Well, I came to aviation law through public international law, really. It's not really coming from business or economics. So it's really public international law, which also pretty much makes sense if we connect it to aviation law. It governs the conduct between states, and international aviation law is in many ways a specialized branch of public international law. And it is really, really interesting sector, I must say, and really kept me interested until now as a researcher.
Garry, I'll push you a little bit if I may. Some would say that these days international public law is on the out. Would you agree or completely disagree with that?
Yeah, I could really speak only for aviation law. I mean, it's really dynamic sector. It's combined not only conduct between states. I mean, the entrance is really conduct between states, but deep inside you will find competition. For example, you will find safety certification. So it's really a nice way of combination of things. It's not really public international law. That's why we have here in Leiden University public international aviation public and international aviation private. So it's bigger than I thought before. So yeah.
It's probably a good moment for me to ask about that legal context that aviation is treated a little bit differently to the other modes, and obviously aviation itself is at the aviation law, the crossroads between sovereignty, trade, governance. What do you think makes aviation law different from the law applying to other sectors?
Well, aviation is by definition international. So of course, where we talk about, manufacturing or mining for natural resources or sort of different, manufacturing, we look at those sectors very much as domestic sectors. Those are things which can be, pretty much done entirely within a state's borders. And aviation can also be something which is purely domestic. Of course, there's some airlines which operate purely domestically, but generally speaking, aviation is quite international. So it touches lots of different jurisdictions, lots of different states' laws, and requires us also to think in a joined up way especially for safety, which of course has number one position in aviation, to ensure that we've got some safety standards and harmonization anywhere you go in the world. So that we don't have overlapping or conflicting rules or regulations as you cross the borders in the sky, which, by the way, are very difficult to see. As we're flying between one state and another, there isn't a sign that pops up that welcomes you to the new state. I mean, so we've got to have this. There is a fluidity in the airspace, of course, above the territories of states, above the high seas, the international waters, and we've got to ensure that there's joined up international standards on the one hand, and that those international standards are then implemented and adopted by states on the other hand.
That makes a lot of sense, Steven. But I can't be a host here and not push back a little bit, because you could make the same argument certainly for the maritime sector, and a lot of the things you said, of course, you could now apply to, say, the automobile sector in terms of safety, consistency of manufacturing, quality, emissions across borders. Why doesn't the same legal logic apply to those other sectors?
Well, I think what's really maybe what your question is getting at is what is special about aviation, and I think that there is that essence, that thing that you can't necessarily always put your finger on, which goes back historically. And I won't give a history lesson here, but the point is that states, the airlines are. Or aircraft in the simplest form, not even airlines, but aircraft are really an extension of the state in which that aircraft is registered. This is the way the international system has been built. And so there's a nationality mark. So aircraft have the nationality of the state. And of course, airlines, then British Airways, if you think about that, Lufthansa, if you think about American Airlines and so on, they are an extension. They are somehow a symbol, certainly, if not more, of a state's power, of its culture, of its reach, and so on the international stage. So there's really there's a public interest, a public dimension to aviation, which makes it very exciting for states, of course. And then also very maybe can be controversial or used as a political tool, also aviation. So this is the crossroads of we have last year we celebrated basically 80 years of the Chicago Convention, our Magna Carta of International Civil Aviation. It was actually in 2024 that it was signed. But anyway, next year it will be in force for 80 years. The possibility of aviation being used for military purposes to be misused is always a risk for states. And of course, the bigger benefit of aviation, unlike, I think, car manufacturing and other types of things, aviation has the possibility to bring us together and learn from each other and create peace and stability, in addition to trade and all the other kind of benefits on the economic side. And that, I think, we can't say about electric cars.
Thanks for that. Very clear.
As you might know, I studied aviation. I studied law in England and Wales as well, but not to any extent that you guys did. And I've been working in EU policy for a bit now. And I have to say, I do sense there's something, the special sauce, what you say about aviation. There's something very special, this exceptionalism, if you will. In a European context, the EU level, I find that exceptionalism sometimes clashes with the market and legal realities in some senses, insofar as the airlines are so used to working in this supranational system where it's member states, and when at the European level, it's also considered domestic in so many ways, thanks to European regulations. Do you think that as markets, I guess the simple word is single markets are created, or market authorities coordinate more and more, that this special sauce might be eroded, or do you think it's there to stay for the foreseeable future?
I don't know, Garry, do you want to comment maybe on ASEAN and EU?
Well, I think what's so special about aviation law? It's cross border, always cross border in nature. It's always yeah, you're right. It's always like exceptionalism in some way, but I do not think that it will change. It will be changed in the future because it's always a good combination of thing of like cross border, international, regional, and national, and we see that in EU regulations. Uh, but maybe I can also speak from the climate perspective. Unlike road or rail transport, emissions from international aviation cannot be easily attributed only to one state. That's why we have seen in the Kyoto Protocol that's one of the United Nations level agreements governing climate change. Aviation was deliberately excluded. This is exceptionalism, if you may like, excluded from national reduction commitments in that sense. Instead, this responsibility was channeled to the international civil aviation organizations, which is really the United Nations specialized agency for civil aviation. So it's always interactions between global, regional, and national, and it's tied to, of course, the nature of aviation itself. It's we have these international flights, regional flights, domestic flights. So, yeah.
I want to focus on the environment, which you brought up ever so eloquently. In the European level, we have something called the EU ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme, which I think we've all heard of to some extent, but I'm sure some of our readers might be a bit less immersed in the file. How does the ETS and, I guess, European emissions trading apply to aviation today?
Maybe I will take these questions.
Yeah, go ahead. You kick off.
Aviation is not always been included in EU ETS. We have to go back to 2012 when the EU ETS for general sectors included aviation. So it is being the first market-based mechanism for aviation emissions in the world. So no other. It's like no other at that time. In a simple term, it's a cap and trade system. The EU sets an overall limit on how much CO2 the aviation sector may emit. If they emit more, the airplane operators have to buy from other airplane operators that emit less. This is why this creates a nice market-based mechanism. So this is creating an incentive to reduce emissions while also creating emission allowances markets. And
maybe I could just jump in here. So, and the idea is that in the up until now, anyway, airlines and other firms and other sectors were able to get free allowances. And then at the end of the year, they have to surrender the allowances that are, and the amount of their actual pollution. And so there's an implied incentive to pollute less. If you pollute less, then you could go to the market and sell those credits, which have been freely allocated to you. And of course, if you pollute more, you must go to the market and buy those allowances. So they are effectively licenses to pollute, which you must purchase, or you can set, or you could sell and make a profit.
And how has that been received by, I guess, both proponents of stringent environmental regulation and the industry itself? Has it been perceived as effective, legally certain, and efficient?
I think it's a difficult one to answer. I mean, what the industry, I mean, I think if you ask the industry, the ETS itself, of course, is not enough. I mean, I think the sector, if you ask anyone from sector, any stakeholder really, from regulator to industry and so on, there's a big problem. We have a big problem in that there are more and more people who are traveling That's a great thing for democratization of aviation. It's a great thing for connectivity and trade and economics and so on, but it's bad for the environment. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? And so the ETS is one way of, through a market-based mechanism, as Gary's mentioned, to use the market to incentivize airlines to pollute less. And how do they do that? Well, then you say, well, it's going to cost us money. We're going to have to go to the market and purchase credits. And instead of doing that, perhaps we ought to invest in newer aircraft, which pollute less. Or perhaps we ought to, I don't know, fly bigger aircraft, or even possibly drop some routes which are more emissions intensive. So there's that thing in, as we normally say, in the basket of measures, which you and your listeners will be very familiar with. It's not just the one single silver bullet solution here, but whether it is legally certain, I think certainly there is the monitoring and reporting that's happening, and this system has been running quite well within Europe. I think it is a kind of a gold standard system. But of course, for aviation, unfortunately, I say that now with an environmental and a concerned citizen cap on, it's not enough, because the ETS is extending only to the EEA flights, European Economic Area flights, right? So we have a limited scope of its application, and that was not the intention back, when it was supposed to come into force 2012, and back when the legislation was published already in 2008.
I think that's also a very, very important point to remember the context that this was originally a device ETS for both domestic and international flights. In my view, it doesn't make a lot of sense just to do domestic, but the reason that international was taken out was, I believe, largely not logical reason, but political pressure. And indeed, there are elements of that going on now in terms of debates, say in the maritime sector that I'm heavily involved in, at say the IMO. And that brings us now to the review of ETS, which is going to start, I think, this year legally, and maybe conclude perhaps this year, next year. And I guess lots of these issues could be revisited. What are the legal and political implications of this review, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think, look, we have to recognize, first of all, that the ETS is, there are a lot of revenues from the ETS. And those revenues are being put into projects and things in different areas. And I think that's a way of seeing that it is, while perhaps it hasn't shifted or curbed the number of people flying, it has earned money to do other sorts of projects, perhaps. So let's put that. I mean, I would give it that credit. But I think that the whether can the ETS exist in isolation as it does at the moment? Yes, it can, but does it make much of a difference? No, it doesn't seem like it does. And that's exactly why the Commission is doing this review, to say, can we continue in this way? Or do we need to expand the scope? What about the other things which have developed in the meantime? I mean, the Commission stopped the clock because of political pressure, but also to give political space, if you like, to ICAO in Montreal, right? For the international community of states to come up with a competing measure like the ETS to achieve similar sorts of aim through the CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It's a mouthful. So CORSIA, now CORSIA is up and running. It will become, mandatory for many states already from next year. So then we're starting to see, I think part of this review of ETS is to consider, and Garry can probably say more about this than me, but is CORSIA working, and is it complementary? Is it doubling the efforts? Is it complementing the efforts? Is it not making any change to what the ETS is doing? So kind of a self-reflection on the ETS vis-a-vis what else is happening in the world. I think that's a kind of high-level view. But I don't know, Garry, if you want to comment more.
Just to add, the closest deadline of the review is the 1st July this year, 2026. The Commission shall submit to the European Parliament and to the Council a report in which it shall assess environmental integrity of the ICAO's global market-based mechanisms or measures, including its general ambitions in relation to targets to achieve the targets under Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement's temperature goal is to hold the increase of the global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to pursue even more to limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. So basically, this is the pinpoint. The EU probably will make the EU ETS aviation in full scope, meaning covering all flights to and from European Economic Area, meaning all international flights, whether it's operated by EU operators or non-EU operators, as long as it's tied to the EEA airport, that will be included. But this will have to wait until the review is conducted. So if CORSIA found insufficiently ambitious or poorly implemented, the EU may make this EU ETS full scope again, covering all flights.
Garry,
and that, sorry, Thomas, if I may say, and that brings us back to the point which you mentioned, Mark, which is, do we come back to, or alluded to this point of that, do we then come back to this situation we were in before with the political pressure? So if and when the Commission says, okay, that CORSIA, it's not doing enough, or it's not an equivalent system, we can see that states around the world have been implementing it, but there aren't really penalties if you don't participate, or there are, sanctions and stuff like this. So actually the ETS is the comprehensive system that we can be sure of, legally sure of. And in that moment, then what happens? And I think, we've just come out of, this has been an assembly year, end of September, beginning of October. Every 3 years, ICAO meets for General Assembly. And I attended, and I can say that, and it's all public knowledge, but, there wasn't a resistance to the status quo, to CORSIA, to the binding nature of CORSIA and so on at that assembly, which we have seen in the past decade and a half, if not more, in Montreal. So that was something I took away and said, no, okay, then seems like there is a kind of consensus at international level, or at least that what they've agreed to, they don't want to rip that up. So that's interesting. That's a different position we were in before. But of course, we also see that there are changes around the world, different regimes, national approaches and administrations that perhaps, if pushed, will say, no, we don't want to be subject to EU law again. And we will not accept it.
If you two gentlemen, I want to dive in, really drill in on this issue. If you two gentlemen were betting gentlemen, how do you think the EU Commission will assess the performance of CORSIA? Has it been sufficient, or does it have at least, how do we put it politically, the tangible prospect of becoming sufficient in the near future, insofar as it doesn't require an international application of the EU ETS, or has it largely failed to really achieve any meaningful demand-based measures or market-based measures, or any emissions limiting measures that one could expect?
Well, I can't comment on the kind of the actual effectiveness of CORSIA.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm only a lawyer, so that involves probably some numbers and things which would make me uncomfortable. But what I can say is that, I think that the Commission will certainly be looking at the implementation of CORSIA in different states. So we started this podcast talking about safety and the national, the international standards being implemented into national law and so on across the world, in states across the world. Well, are states actually implementing CORSIA? And how are they monitoring, and how are they ensuring that the aircraft operators for which they are responsible as sovereign states, right, that they are following what CORSIA is meant to achieve and following the rules and so on. And I think that will be interesting because, for as a law professor, then I say, well, can we be sure that this system, which again, and we've alluded to it also today, international law, well, some may just turn their head and say, I don't believe in, I don't follow international law because it doesn't suit me, which is a travesty, and we must uphold international law at all times, just for the record. But it's possible that some states will not implement CORSIA, even though they're required to do so. And then what? That's then the question. Should the EU go it alone again? Is it taking environmental leadership?
I would like to move on to another pillar of the EU's emissions, aviation emissions regulation, which is ReFuelEU Aviation. It's presented mostly as complementary to the ETS, but legally operates in a very different manner to the ETS. Again, for our readers who might, or our audience who might understand it a little bit, can you explain how it works and what the objectives are long term?
So maybe I'll just kick off. So the ETS, as we've discussed, is cap and trade. So that's about going to the aircraft operators and requiring them to surrender allowances based on what they've actually emitted in terms of carbon emissions. The ReFuelEU is quite different legally because it goes to the fuel supplier, so to the source of the fuel, and puts an obligation or what they call a mandate on those fuel suppliers in Europe to mix sustainable aviation fuel starting 2025 was 2%, and it's being ramped up over time within their fuel mix. And so it's coming at it from both ends, basically saying the aircraft operators should be incentivized to invest in new fleets and fly shorter routes and all these things. And also they will be incentivized because, of course, the cost of fuel is more and more expensive. So that's how it works in practice. So it is a typical command and control. It's effectively a tax, right? Being added to the flight, and it will. At the moment, there isn't perhaps so much of a change to the price with only 2%. But as we increase that number, the cost of that fuel tanking in Europe will rise considerably.
I noticed you mentioned that the obligation is on the fuel supplier, not the airline itself, to uptake, say, SAF as part of their total fuel bill. Is that, the layperson like me, that sounds a bit questionable? Is there a particular reason why that was made in that way, and does it have any unintended consequences or effects?
Gary?
Well, I think it's related to what the point that Stephen mentioned. It's a command and control regulations. It puts directly mandates to use sustainable aviation fuels to the fuel suppliers through the blending obligations, right? Well, legally, this means that ReFuelEU creates demand certainty for sustainable aviation fuel intake, rather than relying on trading or offsets. This is very important because SAF is a key long-term decarbonization pathway for aviations, but it requires a very large upfront investment and industrial readiness for creating that sustainable aviation fuel products. ReFuelEU is designed to accelerate this transition, I think, and also at the same time reducing investment risk, if you like. And it is not a long-term. It is not a short-term replacement for EU ETS as a market-based mechanisms. It's needs time. That's why it's a ramp up from 2% to 2025 up until 70% of blending. And also there's also obligation to blend the synthetic sustainable aviation fuels with a very specific percentage. In this sense, I do think that ReFuelEU and EU ETS are legally and practically, I think, complementary. The ETS addresses emissions right now because that's the only thing that we have to as a short-term solution for mitigations, while the ReFuelEU reshapes, if you like, the fuel mix over time until it's ready. And it's some of the experts would say that sustainable aviation fuels is more effective in bringing down the emissions compared to market-based mechanisms or anything that we have right now.
it may be a bit of an unfair question because maybe going beyond aviation law, but again, my knowledge of maritime, particularly FuelEU Maritime, where there's rather than a producer mandate, the mandate is actually on the operator, the shipping operator. Have you had an opportunity yet to contrast, to compare the different approaches? I say that because many shipping interests look at with envy at the SAF mandate in ReFuelEU Aviation, and they think it was a missed opportunity not to follow the aviation route for shipping, because there is a massive shortage. The problem in shipping is the massive shortage of SAF. And any thoughts on that? I mean, has the SAF mechanism actually, I think you probably could argue the SAF mechanism is doing well in that it's generating the SAF. It's just the offtake isn't happening at the pace that was perhaps hoped for. But any views on contrasting and compare those two approaches and what we can learn?
Well, maybe just to clarify, so that the fuel suppliers have to gradually increase, in the blending, right? Yeah. But there's also a requirement, of course, of the aircraft operators to uptake the fuel. And that I didn't stress that at the start because, I mean, it's natural that this happens when you're in Europe, and we will... because the suppliers in Europe will have to have the blend of the SAF, then all fueling in the EU will include SAF, full stop. Next line says, well, but there of course will be some operators which will want to bunker, right? They will want to fill up in Istanbul, perhaps, fly to Amsterdam and return without having to refuel at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. And of course, they'll be flying on dirtier fuel for both legs of that. And of course, that would be carbon leakage. So we want to avoid that type of thing. So there is, of course, the requirement under ReFuelEU Aviation on the aircraft operators to fuel enough fuel for their flight, including the safety bits of a little extra, right? So, and then to your point about your question about the maritime, I mean, yeah, I think we do have an issue, and we've heard the industry come out and say this, and I have to believe what they're saying because they say it in a very, very loud voice. On the one hand, they're very much behind SAF and they want to reduce their emissions and they want to do these things, but they are also saying, listen, the ReFuelEU targets, the mandate targets, are simply not achievable. We will not meet those targets. And so it begs the question, when you look at maritime, which you brought up, which to be fair, uses quite a lot of fuel, right, to run these tankers and so on. How will we supply these? And perhaps then the ReFuelEU Maritime, which is out of my depths, but that is, perhaps that will come in a revision to that when there is SAF available. I don't know.
Sure. So perhaps, and again, excuse my ignorance here. So given the requirements on the producer, but also the operator for aviation, the market should be fairly reconciled. So why do we have this problem in Europe about the supply of SAF and the airlines complaining about the price of SAF and there being insufficient uptake? What is the market failure or indeed the legal failure? If that's how you read it as well, because certainly in Brussels, that's the big complaint, that the system just isn't working in the way it was intended. Yeah.
Well, my reading of it or understanding of it is not that the issue that it's not that there isn't the uptake. It's that there's concern that future uptake won't be able to be met because the supply will not be met. And I think that the big concern is about production of SAF. And as Garry mentioned, to have these projects, I know that Switzerland, for instance, has initiated or is going to initiate soon a new scheme whereby they will invest in SAF projects in other countries and go into a kind of a collaboration agreement with projects in other countries, because simply the geography and the sunlight and so on in Switzerland does not lend itself to fields of, to produce what we need to make SAF. And so they're being smart about it, saying, we can't do it. We have some money to invest in it. We need to find partners to do this. So I think that's one big issue. And then what's different, I think, also in aviation, unlike maritime, is that aircraft are flying to lots of regional airports at the periphery of the European Union, let's say.
Yeah.
And then there's a big question about how those, because there's also a mandate or a requirement, legal requirement, that airports have to facilitate access to this kind of infrastructure and so on. And we've got to transport the SAF to those airports and so on. And perhaps, those airports are busy some times of the year, but not other times of the year. Then what do you do with the fuel that's there and so on? So there are big questions, I think, about the supply of SAF in the first instance, that it's available, and then distributing it across the union. And then, of course, hopefully one day extending it in an equal way to maritime, including the no tankering provision.
Yeah,
very helpful. I want to wrap up our conversation a little bit, talking about really the essence of aviation, which is the unique international dynamic of it. We've talked about the ETS. We've talked a little bit about CORSIA and SAF. Globally, though, what we're seeing, at least from a political perspective, is a quite significant divergence amongst traditional friends and allies and others as well, on the direction of travel when it comes to environmental regulation. I made a slight joke to Garry about international law. The United States historically has been an opponent to the international application, the
extraterritoriality.
Yes, the extraterritoriality of EU regulations such as the ETS historically. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, there's a law that's passed by Congress that bans U.S. airlines from actually participating in the ETS. What are the core legal arguments underpinning this opposition, and have they developed at all since that first fight in the 2010s?
Garry, do you want to start off?
Actually, we have seen a landmark case on this issue back in 2011, namely the Air Transport Association of America case before the Court of Justice of European Union. Basically, the U.S. aviation industry submitted the joint applications for judicial review of the 2009 EU regulations extending the EU ETS to aviation sector. The case was initially brought before the UK courts, but was then referred to the CGEU. Among other arguments in that case, they challenged the validity of covering the emissions from all flights to and from the EU at the time. The legal grounds relied upon Chicago Conventions 1944, which is mentioned in the Magna Charta of Aviation Law, customary of international law, and also the EU-US Air Transport Agreement. Although the CGEU found that there was no breach of Chicago Convention or the EU-US Air Transport Agreement, opposition from the United States remained politically contentious at the time, which eventually, among others, led to the EU adopted, we mentioned it, the stop-the-clock measures to limit the scope of EU ETS to only intra-EA flights, and it has been extended for several times until now. So that's pretty much explaining the core arguments, probably.
So those are the arguments brought by the U.S. airlines and others supported. And of course, we saw that there was then the momentum with other countries, Brazil, the Russian Federation, and so on, joining together to say, listen, this EU thing, we don't accept this. And that's why they decided to stop the clock and not to stand on the judgment as it was from the court. Now, your question, Thomas, are we in the same situation today? I think that, as I mentioned a little earlier, of course, the world has moved on. CORSIA is up and running. We see that the EU is building bridges with different countries around the world from a ground-up approach, bottom-up approach on consensus on things like SAF production, on emissions, and different things. So we see some development in that area. So I think the world is not the same anymore, but specifically to the US, how the US will react if the ETS were to restart, I think it's difficult to say, but I would expect that probably the same sort of objections would be made again. There is this it's funny to say it for Americans to argue about extraterritoriality, but certainly the EU, there is an extraterritorial nature to this, but of course it comes down to the global commons and the global neighborhood, and the way that, as Garry mentioned, as we pollute in the airspace over one country, it doesn't remain there. It becomes everyone's problem. Global warming is everyone's issue. So someone or some group of states, many states than just a few, must take action to combat climate change. And I think the EU is, of course, doing that. So let's see what the reaction of the US or others might be there. But just bringing us back to ICAO and the General Assembly, the triennial General Assembly, if that's anything to go on, there isn't an objection to the status quo. So if the EU finds that the CORSIA is working, and that it is complementary to the ETS, let's say, I don't expect there'll be any friction. But if they find that the CORSIA is not working, or at least in some states it's not working, like in the US, if they say it's not working in the US, then the ETS should apply to the ES. Then we're back where we started.
Looking forward towards, we're in 2026. 2030 is almost at the door in some weird way, right? It's only 4 years away. Where do you see the main legal risks or even opportunities? We can be positive about it. Opportunities when it comes to aviation law moving forward. Basically, what should we look forward to in the coming years?
Oh, it feels difficult to look forward to things nowadays. I think, listen, aviation is. We started this podcast today talking about the special nature of aviation and the possibility that aviation has to bring us closer together. And I think that aviation has done a tremendous job of that, better understanding of economic prosperity and so on. But of course, our whole system of international air law is built on sovereignty and respect for state sovereignty over the airspace. Now it's focused on civilian aviation, of course, rather than military. And what we see in Europe, unfortunately, is that we are relying increasingly on military aviation to protect civilian aviation. And so I don't look forward to more of that, but I think that's something that, certainly the need to secure our skies in Europe is really essential. So that's really important. That's a top level thing. I think that environment is also still there, but we've had with the greenest commission ever, the previous von der Leyen commission. Okay, now we're in a position of perhaps it was a little over-regulation on the green side, on the one hand, in isolation even. And then if you take that together with what's happening in the rest of the world, we need to remain competitive, we need to be resilient, and we need to have, also things like military mobility and so on. I mean, how do we achieve all of that in Europe while we're the kind of economic front runners? That's a big question there. At the same time, I think we can't be complacent. I have been recently, a few months ago, for the first time, I went to China, and I had a wonderful trip there, and I was really impressed. The biggest impression I went away with was that I found that I thought at least 70% of the cars on the road were electric, and all of the motorcycles were electric. And I thought, well, on the one hand, fantastic, and for the environment. On the other hand, I thought, gosh, where do they charge all of these vehicles, right? The amount of electricity must just be, enormous that they have to produce and so on. And how is that electricity being produced? And all these questions started going in my head. But I think my point is that some have said, oh, China is not being very green and so on. I would beg to differ. And I think that we in Europe have to keep our eye on, even if other countries around us, traditional allies and trading partners, are slowing down on their green agenda, I think we have to stick to it because otherwise we run the risk of being obsolete. So I think that's the same holds true for aviation.
Garry?
Well, for me, it's simple because now I'm doing my dissertations, which is really on the topic of interactions between CORSIA and EU ETS. So probably I will expect in the near future more and more interactions, not only between the global level regulations or international level regulations with regional level regulations, but also it will be the national regulations will be also in the interactions. I tend to see these regulations as living things. They do interact each other, they do adapt each other, and which has a dynamic in aviation sector, not only in environmental protection, environmental mitigation areas. I expect more and more interactions will be happening, and it's really interesting to see the results from the eyes of a researcher like me.
Mark, you and I aren't as competent to speak as our esteemed guest, but we are members of the traveling public. Where do you see the future of aviation, air travel, or in general?
Well, as I think Steven said, this is not a current era to be optimistic, but actually from what we've heard, I think there's a big cause for optimism. And sometimes we ought to remind ourselves that the benefits of aviation and the international rules-based system that has brought aviation really to the fore for the citizen, for businesses. And to be honest, from what I've heard has cheered me up actually, because the system is actually working pretty well. And indeed, the legal cases and disputes are a living part of that. And I think sometimes we should, particularly in Brussels, where we seem to be going down a doom loop, just remind ourselves the progress we've made on the environment, in terms of competitiveness, certainly on connectivity, and a good legal framework that, despite all the trials and tribulations between ETS and CORSIA and ReFuelEU Aviation, the system is actually starting to produce results. And as Steven said from his trip to China, this is not a time for us to lose our nerve, even though everyone is urging us to do just that. So I'm emboldened when I actually speak to people like Steven and Garry, because I think they're very honest about the problems and the challenges. But actually, we should pat ourselves on the back more often here in Europe when we get something broadly right. And I think from what I've heard today, the legal system that we've created in Europe, okay, it needs to be reviewed, it needs to be maybe refined, but we're going broadly in the right direction. And that there are lessons to be learned, I think, for other modes of transport, but also other policy areas as well. It's nice to, I think, end on a positive note for once, that when Europe's doing something broadly right, I think we should pat ourselves on the back and not be deflected.
Hear, hear.
From my end, I'd like to echo that just for my final remarks. And I think we've gone a long way when it comes to air rail intermodality, and having attended a few events at the Parliament on the subject, hosted by some really young and ambitious Austrian MEPs, for instance, and seeing the engagement of the joint undertakings and the rail industry to come together and find solutions to, I guess in some ways, promote a modal shift, but in a way which isn't necessarily disruptive to the business of travel operations and for passengers. I think the future of intermodality is a developing one, and I think we can see a future of travel which is not just based off modes, but really based off a quality connection from A to B. And on that note, thank you so much, Steven and Garry, for joining us, for your time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Policy Driven, and I very much look forward to seeing both of you again.